Welcome to Decoding Leadership. Today's guest is Rebecca Hinds, Ph.D., and author of the new book, Your Best Meeting Ever. Rebecca is founder and head of the Work AI Institute at Glean. She's founded two companies and studied at and worked at some of the most interesting companies in our field. Welcome, Rebecca. Really nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jade. I'm looking forward to chatting.
So, engineering and product leaders spend a lot of our energy making our organizations work well, but we often struggle to find the time and focus to accomplish our goals. And Rebecca, you argue that this is less of a personal time management problem and more of a design problem. And I love how you describe it as a design problem. I think we'll go into that a little bit. I just wanted to start. I loved your book. The book's right here. Right here.
Thank you.
It's packed with a lot of really good information on how to design great meetings. I had to learn a lot of these things the hard way. I wish I had been able to read your book much earlier in my career, but it was just packed with so much good information and so many ideas of how to improve the way we talk and communicate with each other. And I was really honored to be mentioned in your book. So that's how the connection happened. So you write in something in your book about that seems to me to be kind of the root cause of a lot of meeting problems, that there's more incentive to create meetings than to cancel meetings. Can you talk about the role of incentives in organizations and why that leads to problems?
Sure, and you're exactly right. We as humans have what my longtime collaborator and mentor, Bob Sutton, calls addition sickness, right? We are hardwired to solve problems through addition. When we have a problem, we throw money at it, we throw people at it, we throw more meetings at it, and that is our natural default response. Now, I was fascinated in writing this book and prior to by research from a gentleman named Leidy Klotz at University of Virginia. He's done a whole bunch of research on subtraction. And essentially what he's found is if you prime people to subtract, it sort of dislodges that addition sickness and we start to become subtractors. It's not that we as humans don't like subtraction or hate subtraction. It's often that it doesn't even occur to us as a solution. And that's why, being explicit about, incentives in the sense of the goal should not be to add more. And if we are adding more, what can we do to subtract? I think that holds for meetings, but it also holds for a whole host of different topics. I'm, doing a lot of research lately on AI, and there's a mantra right now and a mentality around more is better. More token consumption is better. You're starting to see organizations measure their employees by how many tokens they consume. And I think there's some value in that. But if you're not also being very explicit about the goal is not to add, if we are adding, we should subtract and figure out what we can remove from the workflows. That's very
That
important.
makes a ton of sense. I love that priming could make people more open to that, and it seems to me like so much of meeting culture and business culture in general is something you have to kind of have to acquire as a skill and kind of learn over time. So it's nice to know that's maybe something we should be adding to that list. Um, so in software, we have this concept of technical debt, and in your book, you compare meeting debt to technical debt. How does meeting debt compound? And can you talk a little bit about how to pay off meeting debt, and maybe explain the concept a little bit?
Sure. And, the premise of the book is we need to treat meetings like a product. Meetings are the most important product in our organizations. They're also often the least optimized. And so, if we are going to treat meetings like a product, we should be applying the same product design principles that we know make great everyday products great. And one of those is thinking about okay, just as we have technical debt in product development, we we have meeting debt when it comes to our meetings, and part of it is a reflection of this addition sickness, right? We add meetings to the calendar, and we don't often subtract them. And part of that is there is intense social guilt associated with canceling a meeting. And the more we can normalize this, the more we can normalize removing meetings from the calendar. There are various ways you can do this. Ideally, we're working in organizations where there's a recognition that this needs to be part of the motion, part of meeting hygiene. But even in organizations that don't have that culture, starting to use technology or other, you know, more automatic mechanisms to think about, okay, how do we become much more strategic about subtraction? So setting, for example, expiration dates after, meetings are auto deleted, or you're given a prompt after, say, 3 months to take a step back and assess, is this meeting necessary? Those types of checks and balances help give everyone, a checkpoint where it feels less risky, it feels less personal to go about canceling the
Yeah.
meeting.
One of the things I really liked is you talked about the kind of power dynamics and asymmetry sometimes of who is creating the meetings
Mhm.
and who is having to deal with the meeting load. And can you talk a little bit about like how like leaders can create a culture that allows people to kind of resist the like some of those power dynamics?
Hard. This, I think, is the hardest aspect of meeting design is, in order for meetings to be well designed, it needs to be a collective action, collective activity, and everyone needs to be a co-designer of better meetings. If you have people who are lower status in the organization that don't feel empowered to push back or call out the bad meeting, we're not going to really fix our meeting culture. And so ideally, we're working in organizations where leaders are modeling healthy behavior and proactively soliciting feedback on the meeting. And, small words, small framing differences matter deeply. So I'll often, executives will say something like, let me know if I could have improved this meeting, or, tell me any feedback, give me any feedback on how I ran this meeting, right? And it's not, it's well intentioned, but it's not positioning people in a way that they feel truly empowered to give that feedback. So the difference would be, hey, I know we're all working hard to improve our meetings. Tell me what I did wrong, or give me, actionable areas to improve. It's a small shift, but you're assuming that you're imperfect as a meeting organizer, and soliciting that feedback and making it part of the culture is very important. In the book, I talk a lot about, the more or less psychologically safe you are, the more or less you can be more explicit about that feedback. So if you are operating in an environment that has low psychological safety, you're going to need to be more strategic and leaning in with curiosity, not explicitly perhaps pointing out the meeting dysfunction, but asking questions around, hey, I noticed we didn't get to the meat of the discussion. Half the meeting was spent on status updates. How could we make this meeting more productive? And I often say, in the best case, you're convincing the meeting organizer that whatever you're trying to get them to do is their idea. That's the ideal
Yeah.
situation.
I've seen dynamics where people in, I would say, more vulnerable power positions, like especially being like underrepresented in some way. And
Yeah.
they're kind of in this catch 22 where they are often the recipient of more meetings because they're in a positional situation where it's harder for them to say no. And because they get a lot more penalty if they do say no. And that actually makes their job that much more difficult, which makes it harder for them to perform as well. And so these there can be these ways that these dynamics can affect a huge segment of poor performance throughout the organization. And people that feel much more comfortable about it might be, oh, I'm just not going to that meeting, and they suffer basically no consequences.
hmm And that's, this is one of the hardest parts of meeting design. And it's been really exciting to see the developments in technology and in particular AI over the past year or so, because we're starting to see organizations build tools where some of that onus is taken off the shoulders of the lower status people. So I've seen, organizations auto delete meetings if not everyone has accepted the invite, or auto delete meetings if they don't have a clear, well structured agenda. And, moderators as well, having technology call out the executive or give them a sense that they're dominating the conversation, right? All of these things, we can start to offload onto the technology in a way that I think, it doesn't solve the problem, but it removes some of that, deflection that we often, feel around pushing back on bad
Yeah,
meetings.
I saw a an unreleased feature of a
Mm.
popular calendaring product, and so I'm not going to mention the name because it's unreleased and I haven't gotten their permission. But they're basically they're like vetting the meetings to make sure that they have like agendas and other sort of criteria, and giving feedback to the person making the meetings to kind of push the onus back on them. And I just love the thinking behind that. I think that's such a nice improvement.
I love that too. And I think I hope that's where we get to. And, I've done this for multiple organizations now where you build meeting health calculators and you give for sure the organizer, but also the attendees, ideally, a sense of, okay, is the meeting they're scheduling going to be productive? Because we know a lot about the precursors of a great meeting. Agenda is one, figuring out where communication is happening outside of the meeting is very important, and thinking about the system. And we can predict whether a meeting is going to be effective with relatively high accuracy. Even something like the title gives you a lot of insight into whether this meeting is going to be worthwhile. The more specific the title is, chances are the more intentionally the organizer has thought about the design.
Yeah, you did some research with, I think, Stephen Lee about that. I remember reading
Mhm.
about that. And I thought it was fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about it, what specifically you found? What the two of you found? It was about the titles of the meeting.
This was we did a meeting doomsday together, which is the 48-hour calendar reset where employees delete their meetings for 48 hours and then rebuild from scratch. And as we were, preparing for the change management around this initiative, we wanted to give employees a deeper sense of, okay, as they're thinking about adding meetings back and redesigning, what are some, common tips and tricks that might help them, make those determinations. And so Stephen led the development of essentially a prediction mechanism that would predict whether a meeting was going to be effective based on, both value and effort. I find those two dimensions are not, comprehensive, but they tend to give employees a good gut check in terms of, okay, how much effort is required before, during, and after the meeting, and how much impact is this meeting generating in terms of moving work forward. And so title made a big difference. It was one of the strongest predictors of whether a meeting was going to be effective. We did this at an organization that had no meeting days on Wednesday. And one of the other strong predictors was if a meeting was scheduled on a Wednesday, it was significantly less likely to be effective. And why is that the case? Well, we were finding people resented the people who scheduled meetings on the sacred no meeting Wednesday. And so, this is there are a lot of commonalities across organizations, but there are a lot of nuances in terms of our cultures that, in the ideal world, we're baking into some of these calculations around meeting
That's
health.
so interesting. Um, so when we're talking about effective meetings, you have this framework that you talk about in the book. And I think you called it 4D CEO, for kind of deciding if a meeting is the right tool. Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure. And this is something that, every organization should have some rule that's written down and explicit in terms of what deserves to be a meeting in our organizations. Because for a whole host of different reasons, our knee jerk reaction to problems is to schedule the meeting. And so the more employees have clarity in terms of what deserves to be a meeting, the more they can feel confident pushing back and using meetings as a last resort because they are so expensive, right? There's no more expensive form of collaboration in our organizations than a meeting. And so the 4D CEO test is one rule. It's a two-part test to determine whether you need that meeting. First is the 4D test. So a meeting should only happen if the purpose is to decide, debate, discuss, or develop either yourself or your team. Second is the CEO test. So even if a meeting does pass that 4D test, the content needs to be either complex, so there needs to be enough ambiguity, unknown unknowns, where it probably is going to be more efficient to get together synchronously in a live meeting. E, is it emotionally intense? So if you're needing to read emotions or navigate emotions, you're trying to persuade someone or delivering feedback, probably we need to bring our full human self, empathy, body language in a meeting form. And then O comes from Amazon. Is it a one-way door decision? Meaning once we walk through the door, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to revert course and go back the other way. And in those cases, often the cost of misalignment is too high not to schedule that 15-minute meeting or 20-minute meeting and make sure everyone's aligned.
That's really wonderful. I love both the idea of the writing down and kind of setting some sort of standards for this, and also the clarity of that test. When I was an early manager, I think at one point we had some sort of dashboard, and it was like who creates the most meetings and who's in meetings the
Mm.
most. And I was the guiltiest party. I had created the most meetings, and a lot of it was I was doing a lot of like project management and a lot of coordination work. I was probably doing more than anybody else, and that's what it indicated. But it also was, I think, indicative of, as an early manager, that was the tool that I turned to, and so that's all I kind of knew to do to produce results. And I guess I've had times in my career where I've heard people be really critical of meetings, and I've felt the same way, but I've also felt very conflicted because there's times when like meetings are very necessary. And I guess one of the things I was kind of curious about to hear your thought of was I've sometimes found that meetings can be a very good forcing function for deadlines or for getting people to coordinate or work together. Like if you have two people that aren't working very well together, sometimes you can be like, okay, well, the two of you need to present on this at this meeting. Um, I guess how do you think about maybe alternatives to that, or did you have any suggestions for substitutions, or like how do you think about that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it's so insightful, and what we see is new managers disproportionately schedule more meetings than the typical manager who's been in seat longer. And it's fascinating that we have, we associate meetings as a sort of status symbol, and we all do inherently. We see a packed calendar, and our first reaction is often, wow, this person must be important. They must have high status. They need to be in all these different places. And so I think, because of that, we also have this correlation between an association between managers and meetings. We think that, meetings are a prime tool that we now have access to in a way that we didn't before, and we should be deploying as a manager. And that again, it makes sense. Often it is warranted, but it's a dangerous association to think that we should use this thing specifically because we are a manager. And thinking about, I'm a big believer in meetings, sometimes being a forcing function. I also think there are other ways to encourage that type of forcing function. So I've also seen, leaders and teams, and sometimes I do this myself, ask the two people who you're trying to nudge forward a little bit more to record a Loom video and share it with the group on this deadline.
Nice.
Sometimes it doesn't have the same effect, but the more we can, create deadlines, I often, will frame it around presenting to higher ups. We want this deliverable, or we need this deliverable to be in the hands of this executive by this day. And that can also be, a really effective forcing function, because I do think, depending on how people are motivated, we need to be tweaking, the incentives to align with
Yeah, that
that.
makes a lot of sense. I've never actually really thought about the fact that like there's this permission that's associated with becoming a manager that automatically your job now is to create meetings. And that's so interesting. Like we almost don't even talk about the way that people interact when they're not managers or there's not a manager involved as a meeting, because like no, you're just like getting together to solve some sort of problem. I've heard teams that complain about, like software teams that complain about meetings. They don't even actually count the time that they're spending with each other as meetings. Like if they're getting together to solve some sort of technical problem, they mentally don't even include that in the same category.
And that's the ideal. I mean, so often we have this, and I see it all the time, where executives in particular will say, "Oh, I'm done with meetings. Now I can do the real
Yeah,
work,"
yeah.
right? Or "I had no time for real work today because I was in meetings." And, we shouldn't have two different buckets for, meeting work and real work. Our meetings should be the real work if we design them well. But often, that's not the case, because they tend to be performative. And I think what's fascinating is we've seen meetings become even more dysfunctional since the pandemic. And who is feeling it the most? Well, it's managers, above executives and above individual contributors. The time they're spending in unproductive, dysfunctional meetings has increased more than any, other level within the organization. And that is because they feel it from both directions, right? They're needing to disseminate information up the org chart, and also disseminate it down to their direct reports. And if the communication system is broken, not only do they feel they should be using meetings, they actually often do, because the communication system isn't working from them in either direction, and they're feeling the push and pull. And often the meeting feels like the most reliable way to exchange information and move work forward.
One observation that I've had that I I guess I haven't verbalized before is that I often see there's this pattern with the way that managers, especially and leaders, work, where we fill our time so much with meetings that when important stuff comes up, we actually don't have the ability to meet with each other. And so, even though the most appropriate thing to do would be to spend the next 3 days together solving that issue, um, the only tool we can employ is like a weekly 1 hour slot to gradually solve that problem over months. And it seems like that is like one of the worst things for companies, because it really makes it impossible to solve your most important problems immediately.
It's definitely something I see often, and in particular now, with, so much is changing in our workplaces, and we need to be agile and fundamentally rethink things. And we can't do that in a 30-minute meeting, right? I've long been fascinated by the research on bursty communication. And we see this in both creative and non-creative, but especially creative teams, where they have intense moments of collaboration that can often span hours and hours, and then they disband and they work independently. But if you don't have that space, and sometimes it means, and I've seen teams block off, bursty time, those 3 or 4 hours each week where they know they're going to be creative or will need to, have time to spend on a meaty issue. And even if you don't use it, at least you have that time reserved to focus on the deep work, because it doesn't happen elsewhere. And what I'm seeing in the AI native organizations is there's a high level of ad hoc meetings in a way I've never seen before, because there's this recognition that, we're solving hard problems. A meeting is the right mechanism, but sometimes we have to do that on the fly. And if our meeting calendar is packed, we're not able to deploy meetings in an ad hoc way to solve problems,
Yeah,
dynamically.
that's so interesting. Well, another asymmetry I've sometimes noticed with meetings is that um, the people getting the value out of it can be different. And you talk about that a little bit with often it's the manager that gets the value out of it and the people, the other attendees don't. But I've also seen dynamics where sometimes you are requesting a meeting of somebody else because it's important to you, but it's actually not important to them. And I've kind of wondered about how to handle that um, as an organization because the 2 feet rule where you can walk out of a meeting that's not important to you. Well, sometimes it is really absolutely critical to them. Um, how do you think about that type of asymmetry?
It's such a great comment. And, I talk in the book about research from my colleague Stephen Rogelberg, and he's found that two types of people tend to leave meetings most satisfied, and they are the organizer and the person who talked the most,
Yeah,
right? Those tend to leave the meeting more satisfied than anyone else. And as we think about, product design, user-centric design is very important here. And there's a I thought a lot about the rule of 2 feet. And in the book I try to make it explicit that you should have permission to leave the meeting if you're not getting value but you're also not contributing value, because we need to think about the system. And we can't think about our individual self. Now often I find that managers in particular will use meetings as either boss briefings to share, enlightened insights to their team, or they'll use it to collect status updates from the team. Overwhelmingly, we're seeing that happen in organizations. And in both those cases, doing that asynchronously is, usually much more effective. Recording a Loom video, sharing the updates for the week, allowing people to listen at their own speed, on their own time, usually much more effective. And similarly, status updates, asking people to do that asynchronously, because, well, all the status updates might be relevant for you. All the status updates are probably not relevant for all the other folks who are often in the room.
how important is like getting better at working asynchronously to eliminating or reducing meeting load? Like how central is that? One of the things I'm especially curious, I've come across a number of companies that are just very oral in the way that they approach things, and I'm kind of curious your like what your thoughts are on their chances.
It's absolutely essential. It's a prerequisite, and I think this is the biggest reason why meeting change initiatives fail, is because you don't have those mechanisms for asynchronous communication. And a common misconception is just because we have the asynchronous tools means we can communicate asynchronously, right? That is not the case. And that's why we see Slack being used as real-time communication, email being used as real-time communication, is because we don't have the norms in place. And a big part of that is having a strong written communication culture, being clear. I talk about no lazy asks, right? If we're communicating, we need to be specific about what we're asking for, why we're asking for it. If we don't have that clarity, and if others don't have that clarity, we're going to start to default to meetings more and more. And that becomes really dangerous. The asynchronous part is so key. And remote first organizations tend to do this very very well because they're not face to face all the time, right? They don't have the luxury of having a fully oral communication culture because they're not co located. And so they tend to have much stronger written communication cultures and, as a byproduct, much stronger asynchronous communication cultures as well.
Do you mind giving an example of a lazy ask just to really nail that down?
Sure. So, one of the common ones I see so often is when you're working across time zones, saying something like, I need this blog up by tomorrow, right? Whereas, a clear ask would be, I need this blog on XYZ, here's the link. I need it up for this reason by 9 a.m. Pacific time, being very clear about, the when, the what, the who, and ideally the why as well. And if you have a strong documentation culture, that becomes much, much easier. But often organizations don't have the infrastructure to enable employees to self serve that information.
Makes a lot of sense. What are some things that you think companies should do to get better at working asynchronously, since that seems to be such a big enabling function?
It starts with clear rules of the road. So what is our communication stack as an organization? When do we use Slack versus when do we use email versus when do we use a meeting? Being very clear on what are the norms around these channels. So, Slack, for example, what is the expected response time? When do I use a channel versus a thread? When do I mention everyone versus not? How do I communicate? Where do I link to when I communicate? All of these things around the sort of meta communication is very important. And then I do think formal training around what is a strong ask? What is a lazy ask? The organization that first introduced me to this concept of no lazy asks, ICF, they actually bake this into performance reviews and assessments. So employees are rated and evaluated based on the strength of their communication. And I think that is a big piece of it, whether you do it formally or informally. It's all about incentives, as we've talked about. And if we're just incentivizing personal productivity and personal output, you're going to be hard pressed to encourage a healthy collaboration culture. Whereas if we're encouraging through metrics and awards and recognition, the team above the individual, we're going to start to see these healthier
That's
behaviors.
wonderful. Seems like it also could be a big part of onboarding because when you're new to a company, you're kind of trying to figure out how to operate, and
Mhm.
being given the kind of rules or the expectations then would be a really useful time.
Mhm.
One of the things you mentioned in your book was about pre-meetings and how they can potentially be harmful. Um, a lot of leaders sometimes think of pre-meetings as being useful, like you do the work before the work, you get the people aligned, you make sure that the later meeting is going to go more smoothly. I wanted to hear a little bit more about that because I've sometimes advised people to use pre-meetings, and I want to make sure I don't have a blind spot there.
Mhm. No, I think that there's a time and place for them, and in the best organizations and the best leaders will use them strategically along those lines. They'll recognize that we need to get aligned, we need to flesh something out before the real meeting so that that meeting will have less negative friction. Where I see them go wrong very quickly is if we're trying to manipulate the outcome of the meeting in a way that is exclusive to certain people in the room, that is really detrimental. And in particular, if we're thinking about brainstorming or idea generation, often I'll see people come together before the meeting trying to influence the outcome. The outcomes and what's been discussed in the pre-meeting isn't shared with the other people. So it feels like you're coming in, with different sets of information and on different levels. And that's where, they become very detrimental to the organization because it hasn't been transparent. You haven't had a clear goal with the pre-meeting other than to influence the outcome. And you now have a group who feels, on a different level than the rest of the people in the room.
So it seems like it might be better in cases where the people involved are trying to make sure that the meeting has the right information or the structure or the leaders are aligned on how it's going to go or things like that.
Yes, and I think a good best practice is, if you do schedule a meeting, make it clear to everyone in the room that you're scheduling this meeting and what the objectives are, and ideally share the recording. And often, I find if the intention isn't healthy behind the pre-meeting, you won't feel comfortable sharing that with the other participants, and that can be a good gut
Yeah, that makes
check.
sense. Another topic you wrote about was about power dynamics and how leaders often engage in some behaviors. They're very common. I would say they're just totally pervasive in meeting culture that really destroy a lot of the value of meetings. And you mentioned, I think, three different dynamics: amplification, incompetence, and jerk behavior. Would you mind describing those three and how
Hmm.
they get in the way?
Sure. So amplification, and Jade, this is where your great story came in. We as soon as we assume a position of power, people start to treat us
Hmm.
differently. And all of our words and actions and our silence as well is amplified in terms of its impact on other people. And so when you're in a meeting situation, you'll often see this manifest in the leader says something and people read into it. They look like they're distracted or they're not paying attention, and we take it very seriously. Brainstorming, they'll say something and all of a sudden it's the best idea in the
Yeah.
room, right? That is amplification. Incompetence, this is this happens in multiple different flavors in the context of meetings. Most managers have not been trained on how to run a good meeting, and so they're rolling in late, they're not having an agenda, they're not being clear on, what the purpose of the meeting is. That is, those are some of the flavors of incompetence. And then jerk behavior, this is the most dangerous. It's the very intentional act of bullying or putting someone down. You're being abrasive within the meeting. All of these things, create environments where employees don't feel safe to share ideas, to share viewpoints, and certainly to push back within the
Yeah.
meeting.
And for the jerk behavior, I just want to really emphasize that I often see leaders engaging in that. It's not that they're consciously trying to cause harm or something. It's often just that
Yeah.
they're unaware of the impact of what they're doing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they have certain assumptions about how leadership should look or their own insecurities or anxieties, and it can be totally devastating to the meeting. It's so
Hmm.
pervasive. Let's say I'm leading an organization. It's starting to get kind of big. We've got lots of managers, and I want to make sure that my managers are getting better at running meetings. What kind of advice would you have of like things I can do to help level up those managers?
I think the seven principles in the book, I think are robust in the sense of the different categories you should think about. So thinking about, meeting debt, how do you clear out that meeting debt? It's very hard to shift a bad meeting culture if the calendars are full of meeting debt. And so sometimes that calendar wipe is very effective. Formalizing the training. So there's a chapter in the book on meeting minimalism and how we should think about each of the different dimensions from the length of the meeting to the cadence to the agendas to the attendees. All of these, there are specific strategies we can and should put in place, and often managers won't know that meetings tend to go downhill as soon as they go beyond 8 people, right? And having, rules like the rule of eight and understanding the why behind these, I think is really important. And that's why, I tried to make the book research backed, because I think having that insight into, okay, why do 30-minute meetings tend to take 30 minutes regardless of, the time the meeting truly does require, that I think is helpful in helping people make changes. Technology, especially with AI, understanding, okay, what are the different capabilities of these tools and how should we be thinking about using them in meetings? When should we use transcriptions and note takers? When should we, use other, moderation type capabilities that some of these tools have embedded in them? And when should we absolutely not invite AI to our meetings? That can be helpful and important. I think at the core of it, documenting these best practices is very important, because it's hard to train people. It's hard to expect people to model healthy behaviors if they don't know what those healthy behaviors are.
Yeah, I really love that last one. The I've had the experience personally of being a part of an organization that started writing down the meeting expectations, and I remember there was this sort of convention around, we do our work around the documents. And so what you do is you share a couple sentence description in Slack with a link to it, and you tell people how to engage with it. And I was like, that's brilliant. And it was a very helpful pattern that I was able to apply, and everybody else started to apply it. But it only happened after somebody kind of communicated that, wrote it down as an expectation. I would add to your list that they can buy copies of your book for the employee, and
Thank you.
because I think there's a lot of really good content, and that can be very effective. But I love the writing it down and the training. I think those are great things.
I think the other last piece is, I do think measurement is essential, and holding people accountable is important, because these are mechanisms that consume so much of our day. And if we don't have a sense of what good looks like and our part in it, I think we're hard pressed to really stick to the change and commit to it if we don't have sort of a North Star that we're working
Yeah, I
toward.
totally agree with that. And just to go a little bit back to your talk about meeting minimalism, I loved that
Hmm.
section of your book. It was great. And I just, I really liked the idea of, you can do experiments with your meetings where you have the length of it. You could just do it for one instance of that meeting and see how it
Hmm.
goes. Or you can, like, there's all these different dimensions along which you can kind of simplify. You can make them happen less frequently, and just experiment. Having a culture of experimentation around that can have huge results, I think.
I think so too. And not just because, hopefully you'll identify things that can be improved, but I often find the act of experimentation jolts people out of the status quo. And I talk about 27-minute meetings, for example, and why they're effective. Well, they don't just force you to have a shorter meeting, but they also jolt people out of the status quo, in the sense of, okay, why was this meeting 30 minutes? Could it be 27 minutes? And you start to see people take the clock much more seriously. They start to take the meeting more seriously, and it starts to spark healthy conversations and thought processes around, okay, why is the default, and should it be the
I
default?
love that. One of my favorite moves is to actually cancel a meeting series and to recreate it, because the
Yeah.
expectations are very different. And one of the
Yes.
things I remember learning from group psychology was that the first meeting is where you really establish the patterns of how a meeting goes. And so if you want to change the way people relate in the meeting, you can kind of rename it or almost rebrand it.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
that's actually one of the things I like about the kind of meeting apocalypse, or what, I forget the term you used.
Hmm.
Yeah, the
Doomsday.
meeting
Hmm.
doomsday. It seems like one of the benefits of that is that you also get to kind of reinvent those meetings or kind of
Yes.
redefine them a little bit, and it kind of forces a pause in the way you're thinking about them.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a fresh start, and I'm also fascinated by this research on, fresh starts and how cleansing the status quo, resetting, it shifts our psychology in the sense of, okay, we're starting the sequence by scratch from scratch. Well, we're also starting to reframe our assumptions and rebuilding those from scratch. I think is, it seems trivial, but I've seen it, time after time work in terms of, helping other people understand the intentionality and the importance of, thinking about meetings from the ground up.
I can't believe I'm doing this, but it reminds me a little bit of LLMs. When you start a new conversation, you get the
Yes.
benefit of clear context, and you get to kind of reset all of
Mhm.
the expectations for everybody.
Mhm. Mhm.
Interesting. Um, as you kind of think about the the state of tooling and and so on nowadays, like how do you find that our communication tooling gets in the way? Are there things that you wish that it existed today that don't? What is your biggest critique of like how we communicate with each other online, especially?
My biggest critique is the system. We have great, powerful tools. They're not helping us communicate much better than they were pre-pandemic. And I think that's where we saw the big shift is people had more digital tools than ever before. Did they have better communication and coordination? In most cases not. And that is because we don't have clarity in terms of when we use these tools, we adopt these tools in silos, often by team and function, as opposed to cross functional. And so you'll see this situation happen where you're optimizing for the team and you're making the system worse. And when we think about communication and coordination, that needs to be organizational wide to be effective. And if we're adopting tools, if we're developing norms in silos, it might work for our, individual team projects, but our most important work is cross functional. And we don't think enough about, okay, how do we develop that communication coordination system? And those are all different, right? Communication is very different than coordination, which is different than collaboration. And understanding, okay, just because a tool can transmit information doesn't mean it should be used for communication, coordination, and collaboration. We need to match the purpose of the communication to the tool.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One thing I've observed is that in organizations, there usually is like a percentage of people that think about things in kind of systemic ways. And
Hmm.
I like the overall theme of your book, which was really about designing these things. And I think it really
Hmm.
appeals to me because that's kind of how I think of things. But I also feel like it's a really good advocacy for that type of thinking within organizations because I find it really lacking in a lot of places. And
Hmm.
I've I've been lucky enough to, I guess, kind of similar to you, to be able to see a lot of different companies, and there's a lot of variation in how well they kind of design their communication structures and their collaboration structures, and um, so I feel like this really fills like a good gap there. Do you find that there are some people that kind of take to this design work better than others? I mean, it is something that is a need within a lot, like every company, really. Um, but I sometimes find some people resist it or don't feel a need for it or actually kind of hate the design of it. They just kind of feel like it should naturally work its way out.
Yeah, I think there are. I see this show up in a couple different areas. One is, the person who is very, very passionate about their craft. And that's what gives them meaning and purpose at work above all else. So I'll often see this, I've worked on several editorial type teams and writer teams, and you'll have people who are brilliant writers and that's all they want to do. And so to ask them to think and to expect them to proactively think about the broader system, I think is often a stretch. Who I think does this very well, I think it tends to be cross-functional people. Often they're called super connectors within the
Makes
organization,
sense.
where they are bridging different, sometimes in the academic literature, they're often called bridgers, where they're spanning different groups. And because of this, they're constantly thinking about putting the pieces together. They're seeing the inefficiencies in the system, in the handoffs, in the bottlenecks, and not just in the sequential, step A, step B. What's fascinating is these people also tend to be very good at building AI agents. And when they build AI agents, they're disproportionately more likely to be adopted. And so I think this system, mentality around cross-functional workers, as you're thinking about how can I rally my people, whether it's building AI or designing better meetings, those are often the first people I look to because they tend to inherently have that systems thinking approach as part of their day-to-day
It's
work.
fascinating. As an anecdote, I have a friend that works in a company, and he has found that AI has helped eliminate a lot of status meetings because a lot of the things that people were looking for information wise can be kind of queried.
Yes.
And so
Hmm.
the way he went about that was he actually had people during the status meeting, he would just answer their status questions using AI. So he would be like, okay, so let's get the status update. And he just showed them how to do it. Okay, let's do the status
Hmm.
update. And he showed them how to do it. And after a couple of these meetings, people were like, I guess we don't really need this meeting anymore. I thought it was great.
And I've seen that in so many, I've worked with organizations where pre AI, they would spend half a day Friday, doing the status updates, doing the
Yeah.
project write ups. And if you're not using AI for that, that's the low hanging fruit right now for
Yeah.
sure. We absolutely should be leveraging the technology for
Yeah. I
that.
find for status communication, it's kind of amazing because
Hmm.
you can take a body of information and filter out the things that the person cares
Yep.
about. And so you can be like, only include the stuff that is about,
Hmm.
improvements in speed, about quality or recent deliveries or, whatever it is that they care
Yes.
about. And so that can be really
Hmm.
useful.
And I've also seen, organizations, if your AI tools have enough organizational context, you can do something like, okay, this is, this is the structure of the status update. Give me all the things where there's something unresolved, there's conflict, there's emotional intensity, sort of those CEO tests, and let's move those things into a meeting.
Beautiful.
Perhaps we still need the status update, but everything else can be done asynchronously.
That's really amazing. Um, I really love this book you've written. I hope a lot of people read it. I am so delighted that we got a chance to meet.
This has been great. I'm such a fan of yours, Jade, as I've mentioned, and I'm really grateful that we had this
Well,
conversation.
thank you so much. If people want to contact you, what's the best way for people to reach you?
Sure. So my website's RebeccaHinds.com. I'm on LinkedIn. The book is at your favorite bookstore, and I love to chat. I love these types of
Awesome.
conversations.
Well, I really, really appreciate your time today and hope we get to stay in touch. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Decoding Leadership. As always, I welcome your questions and feedback. And if you're looking for coaching or advisory help, you can contact me at rubik.com. See you next time.